Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 121 called The Fall of the Frankish Empire. In the last episode we heard about Charlemagne's extraordinary achievement, creating the largest empire in Western Europe since the Romans, extending from northern Spain to Germany and from Rome to the English Channel. But his empire didn't last. Within only a few decades of his death, it had broken up, and one half of it was soon fighting for its very survival against a new and terrifying enemy that came from the north, the Vikings. In this episode, I want to ask, why did that happen? And central to this collapse was the reign of Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious, the man who was responsible, in my view, for the subsequent decline and fall of the Frankish Empire. But before we get to Louis, we need to begin with Charlemagne. We left him in the last episode crowned emperor by the Pope in the year 800, and victorious in all of his many wars against the Saxons, Lombards and Avars. In contrast to the tumultuous years from 768 to 800, the rest of his reign until his death in 814 was largely uneventful. The long Saxon War officially ended in 804, and with it his military campaigns seemed complete. But there were ominous signs of the pressures to come when the Danes and Norwegians, who we can call the Vikings, began raiding the Frisian coast, and in the Mediterranean, Arab pirates raided Corsica and some of the Italian coastline. Nevertheless, Charlemagne's veteran army was put on a peacetime footing, and he turned to thoughts of his inheritance. Although one of the things Charlemagne is best remembered for was his coronation as emperor, there's little evidence he regarded it as that significant, at least until the very end of his reign. Indeed, in 806, he decided to break up his empire and partition it between his three legitimate sons, according to the long-held Frankish tradition of partible inheritance. This seems astonishing, given the obvious disadvantages of dividing territory in this way, and suggests he cared little for the idea of a united Frankish empire. But two things changed his mind. First, by 811, both of his elder sons, Pippin and Charles, were dead. Second, in 812, the Byzantine Emperor Michael I recognised Charlemagne as Emperor of the Western Roman Empire, while he was, of course, Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. This was a surprising step, and we'll look at the reasons for it in more detail when we cover the Byzantines in a future episode. But suffice to say, it impressed Charlemagne, and he even agreed to return Venice to Byzantine control, which he'd earlier seized. The result was that Charlemagne's interest in the imperial crown revived in his last years. In 813, he passed the title on to his surviving legitimate son Louis and crowned him co-emperor with himself. The papacy was, however, conspicuously absent from this event. Charlemagne placed the crown on his son's head himself in the palace at Aachen. Not surprisingly, this caused great offence in Rome, and it wouldn't be long before the papacy reasserted its authority, as we'll soon hear. But even if Charlemagne warmed to the idea of a Frankish empire towards the end of his life, he did nothing to change the thin veneer of Frankish government that had existed since the days of Clovis, 300 years before. And I suggest this was his greatest failing. So let's look at the weaknesses of Frankish government in more detail. Ever since Pippin III had deposed the last Merovingian king in 751, the Carolingian government was run by counts appointed by the king. By the time of Charlemagne's death, he had appointed around 250 counts to administer the empire, stretching from the Spanish marches to the forests of Saxony. The crucial difference between his government and that of the Byzantines and Abbasids was that these counts were not officials in the modern sense of the word. For example, they were not paid a salary by the government. Instead, they were given lands in the territories to which they were appointed, normally in conquered lands such as Saxony, by appropriating the castles and domains of the local leaders who'd been defeated and ousted. The counts swore an oath of personal loyalty to Charlemagne, and he knew each one personally. Indeed, one historian has estimated that most of the 250 counts came from only 30 noble Frankish families, so that in many cases, brothers from a single family ruled several counties. These nobles were the king's personal vassals. In Frankish documents, they're referred to as the vassi dominici in Latin, best translated as the master's vassals. Many historians see this as the origin of medieval feudalism, which would take hold in France in particular and ultimately would deny the king power. But in Charlemagne's day, there was a vital difference compared with feudalism, and this was that the counts were not hereditary positions. Charlemagne could appoint whoever he wanted and change them as he wanted. In contrast, family dynasties dominated feudalism. The feudal lords in the early Middle Ages traced their lineage with great precision. Feudalism was essentially about belonging to the right family. You were either born an aristocrat or you weren't. If you were, your claim to your familial rights would last a lifetime. If you weren't, social mobility was almost non-existent unless you were lucky enough to marry into aristocracy. Another feature of Frankish government was the counts had almost no resources at their disposal other than the lands and castles they were given. One historian has estimated there were probably only 10 assistants involved in helping the count govern, and these were paid from the count's own resources. Therefore, the Frankish bureaucracy, if we can use such a grand term to describe it, amounted to about 2,500 people in total, to rule about half of modern Europe. This was patently inadequate for the counts to do anything other than try to maintain some semblance of law and order. How did the counts report to the king? They had to attend 2 great councils a year, one in spring and one in the autumn. These councils were essential for Charlemagne's government since they were the principal method of communicating royal policy. At them, Charlemagne would not just inform the counts about what he wanted to do, but he'd also listen to reports from them about the activities in their territories and judge whether, for example, they needed help from the central army to enforce law and order or to ward off invaders or to suppress rebellions. If a count was misbehaving, such as failing to attend the twice-yearly councils, this constituted an act of rebellion and was punishable by death, and Charlemagne would send so-called missi dominici in Latin, or royal envoys, to find out what was going on. These men would ride out to the count's castle and conduct an inspection before reporting back to the king. The absence of a proper bureaucracy was a very serious weakness for the Franks. Why? Because it meant there was no possibility of raising other than the simplest taxes, typically just the tolls on bridges and port installations used for trade. There was no poll tax or wealth tax such as had characterized the highly sophisticated Roman central government and which continued to exist in the Byzantine Empire and much of the former Roman territories conquered by the Arabs. And if there was no taxation, then the Frankish army would be only the king's personal retinue. As the Romans were expert in demonstrating, if you wanted large professional armies, you needed a good tax system to fund the huge expenditure required to maintain them. Back in a past episode of this podcast, we heard how the Emperor Diocletian had worked tirelessly to construct one of the most efficient and also fairest tax systems ever created in history. And he did it with one aim in mind: to pay the army. The absence of any meaningful Frankish tax system meant the Frankish army essentially remained the king's personal retinue, plus contributions made by the counts, just as it had been under the Merovingians. As mentioned in the last episode, although I estimate Charlemagne might have had around 50,000 soldiers as his central army, which seems quite large for this period, it was in fact quite small considering the scale of the Frankish Empire, and it was certainly much smaller than the enormous Arab armies of the Abbasids, and maybe even smaller than the Byzantine armies, which were funded from an empire containing less than half of the territory of the Franks. Historians have long been puzzled why Charlemagne didn't want to create a centralised bureaucracy. One answer is he was too busy with his wars of conquest, which also developed a momentum of their own. Success bred success, which obscured the need for reform. From 771 to 804, his many victories and conquests became a self-funding source of plunder for his soldiers and a way of extending his own patronage by creating new counts to govern the new territories he conquered. He never seems to have understood that when the music stopped, his empire would be revealed as a house of cards. Despite his legend as the grandfather of Europe, he wasn't a visionary. After his wars, he settled down to a comfortable old age, pottering about in the great palace he built at Aachen, much of which can be seen today. But the inertia of the last part of his reign wasn't shared by everyone. When he died in 814 at nearly 70, and according to Einhard, quote, weighed down by sickness and age, many people thought things needed to change, not least his own son and successor, Louis. Louis, often called Louis the Pious because of his interest in religion, had a very different character from his father. Charlemagne was a man of action, fond of eating, drinking and womanizing. In contrast, his son, aged around 45 and so quite old by the standards of the time when he inherited the throne, was gentle, thoughtful and monogamous with his wife Ermengarde, with whom he had 3 sons, Lothar, Louis and Pippin, to whom we will shortly return. He disliked his father's promiscuous personal life, and on his death he banished the many concubines from the palace, who Charlemagne consorted with after the death of his 4th wife, Luitgard, in 800. His disapproval of his father didn't stop there. He had ideas about the reforms that were needed if the Carolingian Empire was to remain an empire. And to start with, he was interested in replacing the many different legal systems that existed across the Frankish lands with one legal code. Maybe he'd heard of the Roman Emperor Justinian's legal code. Unfortunately, Louis was too weak-willed to implement this, although we know from capitularies issued at the time that he began a program of legal consolidation. It wasn't put into effect, almost certainly because it met with too much opposition. However, Louis was more determined when it came to the imperial idea. Crowned co-emperor by his father in 813, he wanted to make the imperial title meaningful. To do this, he suppressed the royal titles of King of the Franks and King of the Lombards, which Charlemagne had maintained throughout his life, and emphasised his position as Emperor of the Franks. But he still had a difficult problem to solve with the tradition of partible inheritance, i.e. dividing the kingdom or empire between however many legitimate male heirs there were, which was so ingrained in the Frankish political mentality. As I mentioned, Louis had 3 sons, and the traditional Frankish practice was to give them an equal share of the empire. This was difficult to get rid of, since it wasn't just the sons who were vying against each other, but their followers too. However, in 817 he took the bold step of making his eldest son, Lothar, co-emperor with himself, and his other sons, Pippin and Louis, subservient to Lothar. He still crowned them as kings, making Pippin king of Aquitaine and Louis king of Bavaria, but this counted for little. He made this succession arrangement well before his death, partly because he'd had a near brush with death when he narrowly avoided being crushed by a portico which collapsed next to him in his palace at Aachen. But a domestic quarrel undermined Louis's best intentions. In 817, his wife and the mother of his 3 sons, Ermengarde, died. Louis had been monogamous with his wife, which was unusual for Frankish rulers, but according to one chronicler, after her death, he arranged for a parade before him of the most beautiful young noblewomen eligible for marriage. He picked Judith, the daughter of a German count, who was outstandingly attractive, but also, as he quickly discovered, outstandingly ambitious. Louis, who was weak-willed anyway, soon fell under her spell, and when she gave birth to a son, Charles, the future Charles the Bald, in June 823, he became compliant in facilitating her scheme to promote her son's prospects against those of Louis's sons born to Ermengarde. In 829, she persuaded Louis to make Charles heir to Alsace and carved this territory out of Lothar's imperial domain. This launched the empire into a disastrous series of civil wars. First, the 3 stepsons united against their father, and with Lothar at their head, they arrested him and his young son Charles and banished Judith to a monastery. At first, it seemed as if Lothar would be the strong arm that was needed to keep the empire united. But it all too soon became apparent that his brothers Pippin and Louis the Younger, as I will call him to distinguish him from his father, resented Lothar's rule. In secret, they communicated with their father and agreed to reinstate him, which was welcomed by the Frankish nobility, who disliked Lothar's dethroning of his father. Consequently, at an imperial assembly at Nijmegen in 830, it was agreed that Louis the Pious and Judith would be reinstated. Clearly, this left Lothar out in the cold. His brothers conspired against him, and in 831 they agreed a new succession plan which divided the empire between Pippin, Louis the Younger, and Charles, Judith's son, with Lothar relegated to a subsidiary position as King of Italy. Not surprisingly, this caused Lothar to plot against his father a second time, and this time he secured the Pope Gregory IV's support. The papacy had been sidelined by both Charlemagne and also by Louis when he'd first conferred the imperial title on Lothar back in 817, which he did by ignoring the Pope and placing the crown on his son's head with his own hands. Papal support for Lothar was extremely divisive, and it led to a resurgence in his political standing. And with his brothers now supporting him, Lothar demanded a meeting with his father in 833 in Alsace, a meeting remembered as the Field of Lies, when Louis the Pious surrendered to Lothar to avoid bloodshed, according to his biographer Thagan, who recorded him saying, quote, "I don't want anyone to lose life or limb on my account." You're probably hoping that this would at last end the familial conflict that was effectively destroying the Carolingians, but unfortunately for them, it was far from over. Lothar's brothers yet again feared their elder brother was getting too big for his boots and returned to their father's cause. In 834, fighting broke out between the sons. Lothar realised he was outnumbered and again agreed to abdicate the imperial title, provided he could live in peace in Italy. Louis the Pious was reinstated in 834. In 837, the scheming Judith, who was at the root of much of this internecine conflict, persuaded him to proclaim a new partition of the empire, with her son Charles taking the major part. In 840, Louis the Pious died, exhausted by this interminable conflict between his children. In the end, despite his best intentions to ensure the Carolingian Empire was united and strong, he had failed utterly, and it dissolved into anarchy and chaos. The crisis reached a peak after his death, since the conflict between his sons erupted into a full-blown civil war. There were now 4 of them, including Lothar, Louis, Charles and Pippin II, the son of Pippin, who died in 838. And they formed 2 factions, with Charles and Louis on one side and Lothar and Pippin II on the other. In 841, the army of Charles and Louis met that of Lothar and Pippin II at Auxerre, in the centre of modern France. It was one of the most damaging battles in the entire history of the Carolingians. Thousands and thousands of Frankish troops died. One chronicler recorded it was, quote, a massacre whose equal no one could recall ever before witnessing among the Franks. Lothar and Pippin II were defeated. Lothar fled his palace at Aachen. The result was one of the most famous peace treaties in European history, the Treaty of Verdun in 843. In it, Charles, Louis and Lothar agreed to carve up the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts: the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom and the Western Kingdom. Pippin II was excluded, and he would end up in a monastery. Lothar took the Middle Kingdom, Louis II the Eastern Kingdom, and Charles the Bald the Western Kingdom. The treaty is especially famous since, if you look at a map of it, you'll immediately be struck by how closely the divisions resemble the territories of modern France, Germany and Italy. Because of this, many historians have hailed it as the birth of modern Europe. But the distinguished French historian Pierre Richet is, I think, more perceptive. He's written that this division had little to do with the linguistic and racial differences that would ultimately help to define France, Germany and Italy. Instead, he said, the division merely reflected the territories of the followers of the 3 brothers at that time. For example, most of Charles the Bald's followers were in modern France, most of Louis II's in the German segment, and most of Lothar's in the Middle Kingdom between the 2. Nevertheless, the demarcation between these territories would prove lasting. And over the next 1,000 years, today's modern nation-states would evolve from the map of Europe created at Verdun. As Pierre Richet has said, if Verdun wasn't the birth of modern Europe, it was at least its birth certificate. One thing, however, was very clear. Charlemagne's great empire was gone. Although Otto I would later claim that he'd restored it in 962, when the Pope made him Holy Roman Emperor, it wouldn't be until the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte that the territories in Europe corresponding to those of modern France, Germany and Italy would be reunited into a single empire. So, who was responsible for the collapse of Charlemagne's empire? I would say Charlemagne himself didn't have the vision necessary to develop a centralised government that would sustain his empire. If we think of him in Roman terms, he was perhaps a little similar to Aurelian, the emperor who restored the Roman Empire in the crisis of the 3rd century. But where he failed was that he wasn't the Diocletian who rebuilt the Roman tax system and army so successfully that it lasted for centuries after the crisis of the 3rd century. The man who might have done this was Louis the Pious. But as you've heard in this episode, Louis was weak-willed. Although he was undoubtedly well-intentioned, not only did he fail to build a strong Frankish government, he couldn't even control his sons, or indeed his scheming second wife. He became their plaything, and the empire broke apart at the Treaty of Verdun. There would be a high price to pay for Louis's failure. While the Carolingians destroyed each other, a barbarian power in northern Europe was watching them with growing interest. That power was in Scandinavia, and soon they would subject the Frankish lands to a terrifying new set of barbarian invasions, as devastating as those of the 5th century had been to the Roman Empire. That new power was, of course, the Vikings. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll continue with the Vikings on the 25th of October. And if you liked the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter, where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.